Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Chrome Apps Office Hours. Today we're joined by Joe Marini, who's going to be joining us in our Mountain View office. Special thanks to Louis Gray and to Peter Lubers for helping us get this set up. Normally we broadcast out of here in New York City and have people join from London, but we decided to switch things up a little bit today. If you're joining us for the first time, you should definitely, and want to talk about this, be sure to add the Chrome Apps hashtag to any of your comments or any of the stuff that you want to talk about online. Joe's going to be talking about the Media Galleries API. The Media Galleries API is pretty slick in that it lets you get access to all of the videos, the pictures, and the music that's sitting on your computer, just like you would be able to do with any other native app. We wanted to make sure that Chrome apps had this capability. So with that, I'll pass it over to Joe, who's going to start talking about the new Media Galleries API.
All right, thanks, Pete. Hello, everyone. Hello, developers. Thanks for joining us. I am Joe Marini. I'm a developer advocate here at Google, and Chrome apps, one of the things I focus on. As Pete mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Media Galleries API. If you want to follow along with us, there's a GitHub repo that I'll show in a moment. There's also the documentation available online at developer.chrome.com/apps. And in fact, that's the window I'm showing right now. So this is the API I will be talking about. And as Pete mentioned, the Media Galleries API is essentially intended to provide access to the media that the user has stored on their device, their pictures, their music, their movies, and so on. And this API gives you access to that via Chrome apps. So it's a pretty simple API. There's really only one function you have to worry about, and it's this one right here. It's called Get Media File Systems. This function takes an object that describes the kind of media you're trying to access, and then a callback function which will be called back with the file systems representing the various kinds of media on the user's system. So that's the documentation if you want to read through it. I prefer to actually work in live code. So let's go over to the code and take a look at how this is actually written. Well, actually, before I do that, let me quickly...
Actually, Joe, can I ask a real quick question?
Sure.
What's the difference between using the Media Galleries API and actually going and using like the HTML5 file system to go access a picture that the user has on their system?
Yeah,
Why would I use one
that's
over the
a great question. Actually, they're complementary. The callback that I just mentioned that the media file systems comes back with gives you an HTML5 file system object. Well, actually, it's an array of these objects. Each one of them represents the different media systems on the user's computer. The main difference is that the media system that you get back only contains the media types that the Chrome Apps platform supports on the user's device. So you don't have to worry about parsing through files that the system can't play back or anything like that. So think of it as a convenience way of getting at the locations on the user's device of where the media is stored. The system worries about where those things are located. You don't have to go traipsing through the user's device using the file system API. It just makes things a lot easier, but the objects that you get are actual file system objects. So it's a nice little convenience thing.
And I think the other important thing to call out there is that the HTML5 file system API gives you access to a small sort of sandbox portion of the user's hard drive. It doesn't give you like full access to the user's hard drive, right?
Unless you specifically ask for the user's permission. You can actually,
Right.
if you're okay with throwing up an open dialog or a save dialog, then fine, you can go right
Right.
to your heart's content. But yes, this actually gives you access to an entire folder with the user's permission. So it's a nice convenience feature.
Awesome.
And in fact, the sample I'm going to be showing is in our Google Chrome GitHub repo, and I'm showing that on the screen right now. So if you go to github.com/Google Chrome/Chrome Samples, and you scroll down to the Media Gallery folder right here, that's the code I'm going to be working in. So if you want to follow along with me on your own machine, feel free. Quickly, let me show you what the app looks like. I'm going to jump over here to Chrome. This is the Canary build, by the way. And I'm just going to launch this app right here. And this is the Media Gallery Explorer. This is the sample that's in that repo that I'm going to be talking about. So let me just quickly show you how it works. You can see that the UI, I've got 3 buttons up here. I've got a couple of different places in the UI that show the various media information. So I'm just going to click on the Get Galleries Info button. And you can see that right here in this little div, it says Gallery Count 3, Music, Pictures, and Movies. Now, it didn't ask me for permission because I've already run this app on my machine before, and I specifically granted this application permission to go get those galleries. If I want to explicitly ask for permission or for the user to choose galleries, I can do that too. So the Select Galleries button here brings up the UI that allows the user to specify which galleries I have access to. So I can go ahead and turn off movies, for example, or if I want to add another folder, I can click the Add button and then add other folders to the default system folders for media galleries. Yeah, it's pretty neat. So when I click the Grant Permissions, now you'll see that div has changed. Now I only have access to the Music and Pictures folder. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Scan Galleries button now. And when I click Scan Galleries, you see on the left-hand side of the screen there in this div, I've got the contents of my Music and my Pictures folder showing up. And I'll just click on one of these pictures. This is a photo that I took on the rooftop of the Google San Francisco offices. You can see that here's our roof deck, and it was a pretty nice day. I'm just going to scroll over, and there's the Bay Bridge. So I can go ahead and just take a look through these various pictures, and you can see that the picture content is being read in and displayed in the div there on the right. I can do the same thing with music. If I click on a music file, you'll see that I get a music player control in the user interface there. So this is the sample that I'm going to be talking about in the code. So let's jump over to the code. And I'm using Sublime Text here, but you can use whatever code editor you're happy with. So let's start off by taking a look at the manifest.json file. This is the file that determines what permissions the application has and so on. And right here on line 7, this is the one you need to pay attention to. I'm asking for permission to the Media Galleries API. And I'm requesting read access, and I'm also requesting that the system auto-detects where the media galleries are. So when I call this, the system will say, well, sure, I'll just tell you where they are to begin with, and if the user wants to add more, they can add more. Pretty simple.
Perfect. So that means on a PC or on a Mac, you're always going to get the right path, right? You don't have to worry about, hey, where is this file located? Is it in /users you're getting the
You don't have to go. You don't have to memorize what the default paths on the different platforms are. It just tells you.
And if it changes, you don't have to deal with it
exactly.
either.
If the user decides to change the locations, again, the system makes that transparent. You don't have to worry about it.
Nice.
All right, so that's the manifest.json file. Let's run over to what I call the runtime.js file. This is basically the background page. This controls the way the application is launched. A couple of things I'm doing here. First, I'm handling the onLaunched event right here. I've got an add listener for onLaunched. And what I'm doing is I'm creating the window. And then inside that window, I'm setting a global variable called mga b restart. And the reason I'm doing this is because I was playing around with the API for when apps are launched as opposed to being restarted. And I wanted to see if I could just make the app automatically read the galleries if it was restarted versus being just initially launched. So over here down in the onRestarted event, I have the same kind of code where I create the window, but I set that variable to true to indicate that the app was restarted instead of launched. That's all this does. This is a typical background page for a Chrome app. The HTML file is also pretty straightforward. Just got some buttons that control the UI. I've got some divs that contain the content. I have the script tag right here that includes my code that actually runs the application, and that's media-gallery.js. So let's jump over to that file because this is where the meat of the code is. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom.
Hey, Joe, if it's possible, could you bump up your text? We got some people on YouTube asking you to bump that up.
Oh, sure, yes. I will be happy to bump the text up. Hang on one second. Let's go ahead and make the font size. There we go. That should be easier to read. All right. Hopefully that's better. Got a nice full screen of code there. All right. So here in my Windows add event listener for the loading event, I'm setting up the UI. I've got some add event listener calls on the various buttons, and then down here I'm listening for the change event on that select list that's on the left-hand side there. So whenever the changes in the media gallery content of the list, I have an event that fires, and then I update the selection, and this is where I read the picture, read the audio, whatever it is. So let's actually take a look at how this works. Right up here on line 240, this is where the magic happens. You can see right here that if the app was restarted, I call the Get Media File Systems API. This is the restart case. For the launched case, I actually wait for the Scan Galleries button to be clicked, but it does the same thing. It calls Get Media File Systems. And it takes that little options object right there. The property I'm passing in is called interactive, and it says if needed. Now I can pass in if needed, which means if the user hasn't already granted permission, it will be prompted to the user to do so. However, if the user has already granted permissions, that dialog doesn't show up. I can also pass in yes, which will always show the dialog, or I can pass in no, which means don't show the dialog if you don't have to. So the get media file systems API call takes that options object, and here is the callback function. It's called get galleries info. So let's go ahead and scroll up to the get galleries info function. That's right here. The first thing I'm going to do is clear out that content div. That's the div on the right-hand side that shows the pictures, the music, and so on. And then when this function is called, this parameter right here, the results parameter, that's going to be an array of HTML5 file system objects representing the various media galleries. So the folder for pictures, the folder for music, and so on. So I check to see.
So logically, you should get 3 back, and then I would assume within each of those folders. Oh, cool.
Yeah, 3, 2, however many you requested, however many the user granted access to. So I'm checking here to see if that the length of that results array is greater than 0, because then I've got stuff to process. And then I'm just using this for each loop right here with this callback function to go over each one of the gallery information, pieces of information that comes back. Now, the gallery information comes back as a JSON string, and it gives you an ID for the gallery, and it gives you a name. The name is a human-readable string, like music or pictures or whatever it is localized to your system. The ID is a tag that you can use to uniquely identify the media gallery that you're working with. So you can save that aside and use it to go back and get files at a later date or whatever. So that's what I'm using that there for. So I loop over each one of these IDs so that I know how many galleries I'm dealing with. And I store those in this global variable right here that holds all the different pieces of arrays. And then that's how I get the information about what galleries are on the system. Now, the scan galleries button fires off this function right here called scan galleries. And again, it takes an argument for a particular file system. So what's going to happen is it's going to loop over each one of those array elements for however many galleries I got back. And each time it's going to do that, it's going to call this add gallery function. So I parse in the name object for the particular file system. Again, that's an ID and a human readable name. And then I'm going to call this add gallery function, which goes through each gallery and enumerates all the different file objects that are in there. And so what I do is I create a new object called the gallery data, and you can see that in my code later. That's just a little JavaScript object I have to keep track of the various file names and sizes of files and different things the app needs to do. And then I call the create reader function. Now, this is a part of the HTML5 file system API. Okay. Remember earlier I said they're complementary. So you get a file system object, and then you use the file system APIs on that gallery object to do the file reading. So I create the reader, and then on the reader I call the read entries. Again, more HTML5 file system standard stuff. I have a function here called scan gallery. That's the callback that's going to get called by the file system to read the actual folder. And that's up here. So I'll scroll up to the scan gallery function. So the scan gallery function is going to get a whole bunch of file system entries. These are the individual file entries for each particular file inside that gallery. So I'm going to see if the length of the entries array is 0. And when that happens, the file system API is done calling this callback. It's processed all the elements in that particular folder. And the reason that I need to do this is because the way the file system works, especially in the async version, this function is going to get called over and over again because it may not get called with all of the entries in a particular folder the very first time. The system's just going to keep calling this function until there's no more files and no more folders left to process. So if it's not equal to 0, that means I've got stuff to do. So I'm going to have this loop here going from 0 to the number of entries in the array. I check to see if the entry is a file. And if it is a file, I'm going to add. I have a function here called add item. That's going to add the item to that little select list on the left-hand side there. And then I've got this little closure function right here that's going to get the metadata for that particular file. In this case, all I'm interested in is the size in bytes. And I'm not really doing anything with it. I'm just showing that it's possible to get information like this. If it's a directory, on the other hand, and not a file, I'm going to push that directory onto a stack that I'm using to process subfolders. And then down here at the bottom, I'm just going to call read entries again. And so this function is just going to keep calling itself over and over until there's no more files. Now, at the end of this function, that select list in the div on the left is going to be full of all the files that I've processed and read in. So now let's go take a look at the function for the change handler and see what happens when the user actually makes a selection in the list. So if I scroll back down here to the bottom, remember there's this function here called update selection. All right, so let's scroll on over to the update selection code. And that is right up here. Oops, update.
Now, Joe, one thing I noticed in this particular example, you didn't use an MVC framework or anything like that.
Nope.
Is there a reason why in the sample you didn't do that, or was it just sort of like, hey, I want to
just hack it? Yeah, just hacking around. Yeah. I wanted to make a sample where the code for the Media Galleries API was the focus. And everybody's got their personal preferences. People bond with their MVC frameworks, you know. So
it's true. Angular, rocks.
Absolutely. So please go use Angular, but you know, whatever MVC framework you feel like using, that's fine. I just didn't want that to be getting in the way. So here in the update selection code, I'm going over the length of the gallery array to get the system that the selected file belongs to. Remember, I stored aside the ID, and now I'm going to take that file and figure out which gallery it's a part of. It might be in music, it might be in pictures, it might be in movies. And what I'm going to do is, based on the kind of file that it is, whether it's a picture or music or whatever, I'm going to add that content to the div. The way that I'm doing that is up here, I've got these arrays with various file suffixes. So I've got image formats like PNG and BMP and JPEGs. For video, I've got, you know, MOV and MPEG and WebM and so on. So that way I can figure out what kind of file it is. So back down here, let's go back down to the code where I handled the selection. I'm using these HTML5 data attributes. Each time an item is added to the select list, I store the path to the item as a data attribute. So that way I can just simply easily get it again. So that way when I get the full path to the item, again, using the HTML5 file system API right here to get the file. And when that function callback gets called, I have a file entry, and all I do is clear out the content div to clear out whatever was in there before. And then I have these various functions, you know, add image, add audio, add video, and so on. Let's just take a look at the add image case because the rest of them are just pretty much carbon copies. So for adding a picture item, right here, this function right here, add image to content div, all it does is it creates an element, it creates an image element, it appends the image element into the content div, and then returns that image element back to the calling function. So back down here, and assuming the new element was created, I have a function here that uses the HTML5 file system to just read the raw bytes. So I create a new file reader object, I set up an on error handler, I set up an on load end handler function right here. So when the data is finished reading, I simply set the source of the image element to the result of the file read operation. So this is going to come back as a data URL. Right here on the next line on 130, I'm calling reader.read as data URL. So if it's an image, it'll get read in as an image data URL versus music versus video and so on. And then I just simply append that content into the source attribute for, say, the image or the movie or the video. So that's basically all there is to it. I'm using the HTML5 file system to read the raw bytes, and I'm just relying on the Media Gallery API to give me access to the HTML5 file systems that represent the media galleries.
Cool.
Yeah, pretty straightforward, yeah. Again, code is online. This sample is in our GitHub repo. I encourage you to fork it and play with it and test it out. That's pretty much all there is to it. So if there's questions, we can start taking those.
Yeah, so just one question that I want to shoot off the bat. Is it read-write or is it just read-only right now?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Right now, so in the intention is when the API is complete, you'll have access to read-only, read-write, and you'll also be able to add new file content to the user's media galleries.
Cool.
So today, as the API stands today, we only support read-only access.
Okay.
So write is coming, add files is coming. They're not there yet.
Okay. And I noticed as I was looking through the documentation preparing for this that some of these things are still under the experimental and some are no longer under experimental.
Yep.
Do you want to talk just really quickly about what's still under experimental, what's not?
Well, if I remember correctly, the actual code for getting the media galleries. Let me bring up that page again. The Media Galleries API itself was recently moved out from experimental.
Yeah, so that's what it looked like.
Yeah, so you no longer need to put the experimental keyword in
Cool.
front of it, right? So yeah,
Yep.
it's ready to go. So.
Okay, awesome.
Yep.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, let me bring up some of the questions that we've got over here. So DJaz from Sweden wants to know if he can access the local file system using standard open and save as dialogues with a permissions flag. And I think this is not necessarily specifically
Yeah. It's not. Yeah, this is not a specific. This is not a media gallery specific question, but the answer is yes. If you're using the HTML5 file system, you are able to invoke an open or a save dialog. In fact, outside of the local application sandbox, that's the only way to get file content onto the user system. So yes.
Awesome.
But the answer is yes. You can.
Cool.
That was a rather long-winded way of saying yes.
Excellent. Yeah. And then the second question that we had is that let me just reread it here. Sorry. Web intents. I'm going to skip that question. I'm going to go to the next one.
Well, I think the web's intents are good. So.
Boom, chang.
Yeah.
Paul, that one was for you.
Yeah.
All right. And actually, it looks like that's all the questions that we have today. So it's a nice, easy session. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We'll be back next week. Renato and I are going to be joining you. So Renato's going to be joining, I guess, me from Sao Paulo. And we're going to be talking, I believe, about the WebView API. So being able to actually embed the web, effectively a web view within your within your Chrome application. So that's going to give you a lot more flexibility to be able to do some things that you weren't really easily able to do before, or to be able to add stuff to your page. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us again this week. It was a really great session. Thanks to Joe, thanks to Peter and Lewis in Mountain View for helping make this happen. With that, we'll see you guys next week.
All right,
thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Hit me up on G+. I'm Joe Marini on G+.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe.